Welcome back for part 3 of the C5 Corvette clutch replacement. In part 2, we had just inspected the torque tube shaft, the couplers, and the bearings, and we found them to be in excellent condition. I spoke with the owner, and after discussing the pros and the cons, he decided to reuse the existing torque tube internals based upon the inspection we did. At the end of the day, there are risks to reusing old parts, and there are risks to installing new parts. Everyone has to make this decision for themselves, and for what it's worth, I'm perfectly fine with the decision he has made, so let's put it back together.
Toys for life.
I cleaned the machine surface here on the back bearing carrier and put a little grease on it. Same thing with the front bearing. Same thing with where it slides into the torque tube on the rear and on the front. So all the sliding surfaces are nice and clean and greased. Gently install the shaft from the rear and guide it through the torque tube, making sure the bearing at the front carefully makes its way into the part of the torque tube that receives it. Once you are satisfied that the inner shaft assembly is properly aligned in the front and in the back, use a block of wood and a hammer to gently persuade it to move forward until it is properly bottomed out. Make sure the slot at the rear has enough room for the giant snap ring to slide into. And the snap ring has a taper to it, so you want to make sure you install it the same way that it came out. In my case, the white marks were on the outside. It's time to install that giant snap ring. And sometimes you need to tap it with a screwdriver to get it to snap fully in place. It's time to tackle the rear main seal, and I'm not going to lie, this is the part that kind of always irritates me, because the only way to get that top bolt out up there for the rear main seal cover, which we always replace because these have a tendency of warping or cracking, and they sell them very reasonably. So we have to take off the bell housing, and these bolts are kind of tricky to get to. So they're on the perimeter, and it'll take a combination of swivels and extensions and whatnot to get them off. So I'm going to take the bell housing off now. Actually, I'm just going to loosen it as much as I need to in order to get the top main seal cover bolts off. All right, so I've got all of the bolts loosened up on the bell housing. Again, do not take them out. Some of those will be difficult to get back in, and you risk the chance of cross-threading them. But I just got the cover loose enough so I could pull it back a little bit, just enough to get these top 2 bolts out. The rest of these bolts on this rear main oil cover will be easier to get out. And then don't forget there's 2 that go up from the oil pan into the cover as well. So let's get all those out and I'll be right back. You may have to wiggle and pry a little bit to break the RTV loose that seals the cover to the oil pan. Then carefully remove the cover. Now we have confirmation that the iron block engine someone swapped into this C5 is in fact a 6-liter, which is good. And we also now have the cam specs. Looks like a pretty aggressive little street cam, very similar to what I have in my C6. Time to carefully remove all traces of old RTV, especially from on top of the oil pan and in the corners where the oil pan, rear main seal cover, and the engine block meet. Once all of the old RTV is removed, the surfaces are cleaned thoroughly with solvent to prepare this area for the new rear main seal cover. To remove the old oil dumbbell, carefully drill a 1/8 inch hole in the back of it, then screw in a small screw, which will allow you to pop it out. Alright, so here's our parts table. Here is the old cover with seal. There's a brand new seal. There's the old dog bone that I just pulled out. There's a new one. Here is a Mr. Gasket main seal installer tool. Here is the new gasket for the rear main cover and the main cover and the rear main seal, and it even has new bolts to hold the cover on. To install the new barbell, this end goes in first. I put a little oil on the O-ring and we'll just slide it home. Easy peasy. The top of the oil pan received a thin layer of RTV, as did the intersections in the corner of the block oil pan and rear main seal cover. Then the rear cover is installed with the help of a rear main seal cover installation tool, which perfectly centers the cover around the crankshaft. Next, the new seal is installed and the rear main seal tool acts as a seal driver for gently pounding the new seal into place. Now it's time to pull the pilot bearing out of the center of the crankshaft. For the old school guys out there, do not fill this up with grease and hit it with a big round bar. You will punch out a cap in the crankshaft and now you're pulling the motor. You cannot use the grease method or the bread method.
I don't see any bread in the hole. The guy said he cleaned out all the bread, so it looks like the inside of that crank is hollow on that rear main because he's knocked the freeze plug. I can see what he's talking about now. He's knocked the freeze plug clean up in that crank. Oh my goodness, look at that. There it is. Oh my goodness. He's definitely gonna have an oil leak. Okay, that wasn't a good idea.
This is kind of a scary part, pulling out this pilot bushing, which you always need to replace. Here's what I've got going on. It's a modified OEM tool that I've slightly ground the ends of these little forks, if you will, and I'll get those situated in there, and then we use the slide hammer, and these can be a pain in the ass to get out, so hopefully this one comes out. It doesn't look corroded or anything, but we'll see. Okay, I've got the tool situated in there. It's tightened down, which expands those little forks to grab the pilot bearing, and I'm going to screw Mr. Wonderful here onto the end, and we'll see if it'll come out. Fingers crossed. All right, that was good. This is one of those things that could go difficult, but I got this out in one try, so I'm thankful. To make installing the new pilot bearing a little bit easier, put it in the freezer for a good hour or so to make it a tiny bit smaller. Even with freezing the pilot bearing, it takes quite a bit of force. Make sure you've got a socket that is just slightly smaller than the diameter of the pilot bearing. Get that lined up and then drive it home, making sure to keep your socket nice and level with the edges of the bearing. And it should go in till it is just ever so slightly past the edge of the crankshaft. Now we're getting to the fun stuff. What we have here is an LS7 clutch kit for the C5. It holds 505 horse from the 7-liter LS7 that goes in the C6 Z06. So it should be good enough for this car. I've already cleaned the pressure plate and the flywheel with wax and grease remover, so it's time to put the flywheel on. We've got new hardware for the flywheel and for the pressure plate, so let's get it installed. I torqued the flywheel bolts down in 3 steps. Round 1 is 15 pound-feet, round 2 is 37 pound-feet, and round 3 is 74 pound-feet. This is very important. Since we had the bell housing loose to put the rear main seal in, leave it loose, because in order to get the pressure plate and the flywheel in here, you're going to need that extra clearance to get it up through here. Otherwise, it's going to hit these alignment pins. Clean everything one more time with solvent to be 100% sure the surfaces are perfectly clean. Now install the pressure plate and the clutch disc together and slip the pressure plate onto the 3 alignment dowels. Then start a couple of the bolts to make sure it cannot fall. A few things about the pressure plate installation. First, I will be using blue Loctite on the pressure plate bolts. Second, right now I have a plastic alignment tool in here, but I've had issues with these in the past, leading to torque tubes that don't want to go in, so I bought this steel one from Ram for about $50, which I will insert in a moment, and this is machined to tighter specs than any plastic one could be. And number 3, I will be rotating the flywheel with this flywheel tool from OEM so that I can tighten the pressure plate bolts a little at a time so as not to distort the pressure plate. All right, that's a workout for sure. I've got all of the pressure plate bolts torqued down. Now I can remove my alignment tool. And I know that this is more precise than the plastic ones because it's a super snug fit in the splines of the clutch disc, which to me means it's going to hold it straighter, allowing for a higher chance of success when stabbing the torque tube upon final assembly. Now I have to go ahead and retorque the bell housing bolts to the engine block. Also, if you look into this much, you'll see there's some self-adjusters here on the LS7 pressure plate. And I've seen various things, and in my experience in the past, it can take a few hundred miles for the clutch pedal to get right where it feels like it should be as these self-adjust. I've seen some different things on the forums, so I did call Texas Drivetrain. They told me on the C5s they just put this in. They don't typically do any sort of an adjustment process manually with these. For those that aren't familiar, this is the slave cylinder that actuates the pressure plate and the clutch. Here's the line that goes to the clutch master cylinder. And here's the infamous bleeder valve that when the car is put together, you'll never get to. So we will be installing a remote bleeder that makes bleeding the slave cylinder easy. This is the throwout bearing. It's very smooth. So we're going to be reusing this. No, just kidding. Relax, relax. You never want to reuse this because it's a hydraulic system. There's a lot of dirt and dust in here, some heat, and you have no way of inspecting really the integrity of the hydraulic system. So we always replace the slave cylinder. End of story. Now it only attaches with these two 10mm bolts. So let's take this thing off and we're going to remove the spring so we can measure the distance of the throwout bearing to the seam between the torque tube and the bell housing so we can get our throwout bearing to pressure plate clearance. To measure the clearance between the throwout bearing and the pressure plate fingers, we want this fully compressed, so we have to remove this spring. And the way we do that is we rotate this plastic thing either clockwise or counterclockwise until it stops, and then we'll use a screwdriver here and we'll pry this off. We'll take the spring out and then put it back together so we can fully collapse it. Okay, now I've removed the spring from my new slave cylinder and we've got this fully compressed right here. Now we're going to measure the distance between this surface and that surface, and we'll do the same thing on the torque tube. 2 and 10 30-seconds. 2 and 10 30-seconds. Okay, and here I am underneath the car measuring the same dimension from the flange on the bell housing to the fingers on the pressure plate with it fully bolted down. I just use a machinist rule. Here's my two measurements and here's the final number, so I'm golden. You know, I noticed on this wiring harness, which lays right on top of the front of the torque tube, it's kind of worn down. There's no conductors showing, but that's just a matter of time. So I can't leave that as is. I got to fix that. So can you imagine trying to diagnose this with the car? You know, you got some sort of a short going on with something in the back of the car. There's no way you're ever going to get to these wires. So take the time right now and cover that up good to make sure it's got plenty of abrasion resistance. I'm going to be fixing the transmission leak. In the vast majority of manual transmissions I've seen, they leak between the main transmission body and this rear tail shaft. So we're going to be unbolting this and pulling this back enough to clean the entire flange, put a little RTV on it, and then seal it back up.